August morning in 2017 began with an unusual disturbance in the quiet grounds of Beth Israel Hospital, Boston. 6 unmarked police cars silently pulled up in front of the eastern glass building where the early sunlight reflected off the long, endless rows of windows. Hospital staff huddled behind the reception desk, peering through the glass as officers in bulletproof vests fanned out through the hallways. Inside the anesthesia room, Dustin Perry, 59, was pouring coffee, his morning ritual before his shift. The model colleague, calm and trusted by everyone for 3 decades. A rapid knock echoed at 7:32 a.m. Dustin Perry, Boston Police. "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1988 disappearance of nurse Megan Walsh." Colleagues later recounted that his hand trembled slightly as he set the cup down, but his face remained eerily composed, as if he had known this day would come. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. The last night of June 1988. Boston was immersed in a cold rain and sleet, rolling in from the seaport harbor. The yellowish streetlights reflected on the wet, patchy asphalt, casting a hazy glow like breath on the venerable red brick buildings of the South End. Amid the wind mingling with the distant echo of ship horns, the city seemed to hold its breath. At Boston City Hospital, the night shift ended later than usual. Megan Walsh, a 29-year-old pediatric nurse, petite in stature, stepped out of the nursing ward's side door. She wore a green raincoat, clutching a faded gray canvas bag, her shoulders slightly hunched, her steps hurried but weary in each stride. A colleague called after her, asking if she wanted a ride. Megan turned back, smiled, and shook her head lightly. "It's okay, I feel like walking a bit." Then she turned onto Harrison Avenue, where the golden sodium lights were gradually swallowed by the thick fog. A hospital security guard later said he still saw her pass the main gate, her small figure swallowed by the rain, then vanishing around the bend. That was the last time anyone saw Megan. The next morning, her small apartment in South Boston remained untouched. The door locked from the inside, the kitchen light still on, and on the table, an unfinished meal, a portion of cold pasta, a half-full glass of water. Her coat draped over a chair, her wristwatch on the shelf, no signs of haste. Her mother, Ellen, called several times with no answer. At first, she thought her daughter had overslept after the night shift, but as noon struck, a premonition began to tighten in her chest. "She never didn't come home," she said later. That afternoon, her father, Patrick, drove to the hospital, questioning every security guard, every on-duty nurse, but no one had seen Megan since the night before. Boston's sky turned gray again, the fog thickening, and the church bells on Union Street tolling amid the old buildings. In the small kitchen in Quincy, Mr. and Mrs. Walsh sat silently by the phone, the light casting tense shadows on their faces. At 8 p.m., when there was nowhere left to look, Ellen dialed the police. On the other end, the desk officer's voice was low and steady. "Just to confirm, you say your daughter hasn't come home since last night," she replied, her voice trembling. "Yes, but Megan would never disappear like this." Outside, the rain fell heavier. As the City Hall clock struck 9, a new file was opened at the Boston Police Department, the disappearance of Megan Walsh. The wail of police sirens echoed from afar, spreading with the thin morning rain of Boston. As the first patrol car turned onto Dorchester Avenue, its blue and red lights reflected on the wet, patchy road like a streak of cold light. Ellen Walsh stood in front of her daughter's apartment door, clutching Megan's coat tightly, silent. The door was opened with a spare key, the hinges creaking softly. The air inside was cold, thick with the musty smell of dampness and old coffee. The apartment was tidy, everything frozen just as it was the night before. The kitchen light still on, the cold meal untouched on the table. A glass of water sat beside the plate of pasta, morning fog condensing on the rim. The police looked around, no signs of a struggle, no displaced objects. Outside the window, ship horns echoed from the seaport, long and heavy. In the corner of the living room, the landline phone sat still, the cord neatly coiled, silent. When they opened the closet, Megan's coats hung complete, missing only the green raincoat. A young officer named Chris Knight entered, his eyes scanning the space as if searching for any anomaly. He quietly circled the room, bending down to check the floor, then looking toward the garage access to the basement. "Open the door, check down there," he said. The heavy wooden door groaned as it opened, the smell of gasoline and damp metal rising up. Megan's silver Chevrolet Nova remained parked in its spot. The driver's seat slid slightly back, as if someone had just sat there and left in a hurry. On the driver's door handle, the flashlight beam caught a faint dark brown streak, so small it required leaning close to notice. Another officer murmured, "Could be rust." Knight said nothing, pulling a white cloth from his pocket, touching it lightly. The brown stuck to the fabric, thick and dry, not dust. He folded the cloth, placed it in his coat pocket, his face briefly tense. On the floor, a water streak stretched to the wheel, fading, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. No one spoke, only the patter of rain dripping from the downspout outside the stoop. As they left the garage, Knight asked Megan's mother, did she often go anywhere after her shift? Ellen shook her head. She always came straight home, no matter how late. Knight jotted quickly in his notebook, then glanced at the man standing in the hallway, Dustin Perry, Megan's husband, who had just arrived. He wore a hospital jacket, the collar soaked, his eyes red but not swollen. "I heard the news this morning," Dustin said, his voice even. "She worked the night shift, maybe wanted to take a walk. She's been tired lately, needed some quiet." Knight asked when he last saw his wife. "Last night, before her shift," Dustin replied. "We talked briefly, nothing serious." He finished speaking, his eyes averted, hand rubbing his forehead lightly, as if searching for more words, but then just shrugging slightly. No one asked further. Another officer approached, whispering something in Knight's ear, then handing him a sealed bag containing the brown residue from the door handle. Knight nodded, turning back to Dustin. "Her car's still here. Do you have the keys?" Dustin pulled them from his pocket, hesitating a moment before placing them in Knight's hand. The car door opened, nothing unusual except the damp smell and faint old gasoline. On the passenger seat, a few folded receipts, a notebook lightly damp at the edges. Knight closed the door, handed the keys back to Dustin, saying softly, "We'll need to contact you if we have new information." Dustin nodded, stepped outside, his gaze not lingering on anyone. As the officers packed up and left, the fog still blanketed the street. Ellen stood at the threshold, looking at the empty apartment, then turned away, clutching her daughter's raincoat. Chris Knight paused for a moment, watching the rainwater flow along the curb, carrying away tiny specks of dust, all gone in minutes. He got into the car, closed his notebook, murmured, "No signs of crime, but something's off." The engine roared to life, tires rolling over the wet, patchy road, leaving behind the dim light of apartment 12. In the morning dampness, the official investigation began, as quietly as Megan's disappearance from this city. That same afternoon, as the fog from the sea pulled back into the city, the streets around Harrison Avenue sank into a hazy mist. Chris Knight returned to the hospital area where Megan had left the night before, to retrace the route she might have taken. The neon lights on the hospital glass reflected like flickering streaks in the steady rain. He questioned the night security guard, the middle-aged man who had seen Megan leave the gate. "She walked alone, heading toward D Street," he said, his voice hoarse. "I heard a metallic clank somewhere a few minutes later, like a car hitting a trash can, but couldn't see clearly in the rain." Knight was silent, noting the detail in his mind. The clank, if real, could be the last pinpointed location of Megan on the timeline map. He stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the mist lingered thick, tiny droplets rolling on the car roof like cold sweat. Not far away, at the all-night convenience store on Washington Street, The cashier vaguely remembered seeing Megan. When Knight showed the photo, the young woman nodded immediately. She bought a bottle of milk and a pack of cookies, around 10:30, she said. Looked a bit tired, but polite, even wished me good night. The end-of-day receipt was still in the drawer, stamped clearly at 10:31 p.m. Knight carefully folded the paper, tucked it into his pocket. The few minutes between the last transaction and the time the guard heard the clank could be the exact window when Megan vanished. Back at the apartment, the afternoon light had turned golden, slanting through the fog-condensed glass door. Knight went straight down to the garage. The smell of oil and rust still pungent, the concrete floor damp, the flashlight beam casting flickering streaks. He bent close to the floor, where that morning he had seen a long water streak, now dried, leaving a dark-edged line. Touching it, he felt the dust smeared into a narrow, even band, as if something heavy had been dragged across, leaving a faint groove. The drag mark wasn't deep, but it pointed toward the garage door. He looked around, no new tire tracks, just the solitary drag streak, intermittent, then vanishing right at the exit door, where the rain outside had washed away the rest. Inside the apartment, Ellen and Patrick still sat silently, exhausted. On the dining table, amid cold coffee cups, Knight noticed a small scrap of paper clipped under a plate. The paper was damp at one corner, the blue ink slightly smudged. The handwriting hurried, scrawled but clear. "Tell the boys I'll be back soon." Ellen saw it, her hand trembling. "Megan didn't write like this," she said, her voice thick and hoarse. "She never wrote all caps. She always mixed cases, like she was writing and talking at the same time." Knight flipped the back, blank. No signature, no date, nothing else. He placed the paper back on the table, avoiding her eyes. A fragment of a message left in the silent apartment, half promise, half farewell. Outside, a light rain began again. Knight stepped out to the front door, observing the long street stretching toward the harbor. Fresh puddles forming on the sidewalk. In the patter of rain on the car roof, his mind swirled with scattered pieces. The metallic clank at 10:40 p.m., his store receipt, the drag mark on the garage floor, and the short note with its odd message. Everything disparate, but all pointing in one direction, the moment Megan left the hospital and the path leading to the quiet seaport area. He knew, in disappearances like this, time was the enemy. Each hour that passed, an opportunity vanished. Knight stepped closer to the Chevrolet, peering inside through the glass. The driver's seat slid slightly back, gear in park, keys still hanging on the hook in the kitchen. He suddenly noticed a few small round gray specks of dust on the seat, not like ordinary dust. When he swiped his hand, the dust smeared into a faint streak like ash. No reasonable explanation at the time, but he had a hunch about something wiped clean. He looked up, the streetlight reflecting on the car window, creating a streak that split his face in two. Back in the apartment, Ellen asked softly, "Do you think she's okay?" Knight looked down at the paper on the table, then at her. "We'll find out," he said, though in his heart he wasn't sure he believed it. Outside, the wind from the harbor blew hard, scattering wet old flyers stuck to the wall. The rain began falling harder, and in that small house, only the rustle of raindrops hitting the wooden frame remained, mingling with the chill of something that had just left this world without a trace. 2 days after Megan vanished, the rain hadn't let up. Boston was shrouded in thick, gloomy air, the streets along Dorchester Avenue glistening with water like they'd been coated in a thin layer of glass. Chris Knight returned to the victim's apartment, this time with 2 other investigators. He carried a short list of people to interview, the top one being Dustin Perry, Megan's husband, the last person confirmed to have seen her before she disappeared. The house they lived in was less than 3 miles from the hospital, an old 2-story home painted silver gray, with tall grass in the yard. Dustin opened the door when they arrived. He wore a thin sweater, hair still wet, eyes tired but alert, as if prepared for this visit. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice calm. "I already told the police everything the other day." Knight replied curtly, We just need to check a few details. Inside, the house was so clean it felt cold. Every item on the table arranged neatly, not a speck of dust. As they walked down the hallway, Knight noticed a picture frame on the shelf, their wedding photo, taken in front of St. Peter's Church. Megan's smile still bright and natural enough to make him pause and look a moment longer. Dustin led them into the living room. She usually came home late, but never without calling, he said, then sat on the couch, hands clasped. That night we talked a bit. She was tired. I suggested she quit early. Then she went to work. That's it, Knight asked again. Are you sure there was no argument before she left? Dustin smiled faintly, shook his head. I'm a calm guy, officer. I can't even remember the last time we argued. One of the accompanying officers stepped out to the back of the house, where there was a small room with walls hung with Dustin's medical diplomas and certifications. Right next to the desk was a low metal cabinet, loosely locked. The officer bent down, pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a .357 Magnum revolver, its steel barrel gleaming like newly polished. No dust, no fingerprints. He called Knight over. Dustin watched them, his voice slightly hoarse. I have a valid permit. I haven't used it in years. Knight asked, why is it so clean? The man shrugged. I clean the gun periodically. Hobbit. Knight said nothing, just signaled his colleague to seize the gun for testing. He checked the safety, observed the chamber empty, the barrel smelling of lubricant oil, a familiar medical scent. He glanced at Dustin, the man's face expressionless, eyes unblinking. As the group left the house, neighbors peered from behind curtains. A middle-aged woman, after the patrol cars were out of sight, stepped out and called after Knight, Officer, I have something to say. She recounted that on the night Megan disappeared, around midnight, she heard a loud engine revving from the Perry house. I looked out the window, saw his car, a green Civic, backing out of the garage and turning quickly toward the harbor, she said, her voice certain. I remember clearly, because the headlight shone straight into my window. Knight asked if she saw anyone else in the car, but she shook her head. No, it was too dark. Just him. Late afternoon, Knight cross-checked this information with the morning statement. Dustin claimed he slept at home all night, didn't leave the bed. When Knight asked about the car, he said it wasn't running that night, because it was out of gas. The clear contradiction made the air in the interrogation room sag. Knight quietly observed the man before him, hands on the table, thumbs tapping a steady rhythm, not anxiety, but control. In the forensics lab, the .357 was examined. No fingerprints, no blood, no recent firing residue. Under UV light, the barrel gleamed as if freshly wiped with alcohol solution. The forensic report showed no GSR, gunshot residue, nor DNA. Technically, it was just a legal gun, unconnected to any criminal activity. That evening, as Knight sat in his car outside the police station, rain pattering on the windshield, he opened his notebook, looking at the name Dustin Perry and scattered notes. 357 clean. 2 clean. Statement doesn't match. Car left house 11 p.m. No shots, no GSR, all like puzzle pieces missing connections. He closed the notebook, started the car. In his mind still echoed the husband's calm words. I'm a calm guy. Boston outside darkened, lights casting on foggy windows, and in the rain, Knight felt the line between disappearance and crime growing thinner than ever. 2 days after the house search, the rain had stopped, but Boston still wore a thick, heavy fog. In the small office at the city police department, Chris Knight sat silently before a cold cup of coffee. Eyes fixed on the crime scene photos spread on the table, the unfinished dinner, the brown streak on the car door handle, the paper with the scribbled line, "Tell the boys I'll be back soon." He had read that sentence over 20 times, trying to see it as a note or a goodbye. In the corner of the room, an old fan rattled steadily, as if marking the beat of the investigation's deadlock. For a week, Knight had no new leads. The report on Dustin Perry's 357 gun found nothing suspicious. No fingerprints. No firing marks. No DNA. The brown residue on Megan's car door handle was determined insufficient sample for testing. Those scant pieces of evidence couldn't take him further. Meanwhile, Dustin was cooperative, frequently calling to ask about progress. His voice so even and composed it was hard to gauge sincerity. "I just want her back," he said, in one brief conversation. "Maybe she needs time." That statement, simple but loaded with implication, wormed into Knight's thoughts more than he cared to admit. On the 8th morning since the disappearance, Knight returned to Megan's apartment with a superior officer for a final sweep, before temporarily closing the file. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the thin dust layer on the dining table and kitchen shelves. The air in the house had lost the coffee smell, leaving only silence. Knight stood before the handwritten note. He donned gloves, carefully lifting it, examining each ink stroke, the letters even, no tremor, no pen scratches, as if the writer was fully alert and intentional. Though Ellen insisted the handwriting didn't match her daughter's, to Knight, this was the only piece that created a plausible scenario. Megan left home calmly, for personal reasons. That afternoon, at the internal meeting, Knight presented the hypothesis that Megan may have left voluntarily for a time. He said, his voice firm but slow. "No evidence of violence, no signs of force, possessions intact, and she left a note." A few colleagues nodded. One asked quietly, "If so, where did she go?" Knight didn't answer. He just said that women in healthcare often faced immense pressure, long night shifts, simmering family tensions. She might have needed space. The Walsh family was invited that afternoon. In the reception room, the air was taut as a wire. Ellen held the paper in her hand, tears falling and smudging the ink. "You really think my daughter ran away? Megan never went anywhere without telling us." Patrick gripped his wife's hand, looking at Knight with eyes mixed with anger and pleading. "He's lying. I know it. The way Dustin looks at us, the way he talks, it's not real." Knight was silent. He knew he couldn't make assurances when all evidence contradicted their intuition. Finally, he said softly, "We'll keep the file open. If there's news, you'll be the first to know." That evening, stepping out of the station, the wind from the harbor blew icy cold. Knight paused on the sidewalk, looking toward the city lights flickering from the seaport area. Everything was still, only the swish of tires on the wet road. He felt like something had been overlooked, a small but crucial detail buried somewhere among the photos and dry statements. But superiors had decided the case classified as voluntary disappearance. A few days later, the file was moved to the archives, bearing number #88743. The scant evidence, the handwritten note, the brown residue on the door handle, a few garage photos, was sealed in thick envelopes, taped shut. Megan's apartment was handed back to the landlord. Keys returned to the family. People still passed by Harrison Street daily. Buses still stopped at the hospital gate, where she once worked. And the name Megan Walsh gradually faded from police station conversations. Only Knight, occasionally passing through South Boston, still glanced up at the old apartment with a sense of unfinished business. He knew some cases didn't close with administrative decisions, but with a heavier silence, the silence of a question no one had dared answer. And that very silence began to give the voluntary disappearance file of Megan Walsh the scent of something not voluntary at all. File #88743 was transferred to the basement archives of the Boston Police Department on an early autumn morning in 1988. An administrative clerk quickly scrawled the case number on the cardboard cover, labeled it, then stacked it atop stacks of yellowed documents. Inside the sealed envelope were just a few items: 3 crime scene photos, a scrap of paper with the line, "Tell the boys I'll be back soon," a copy of Dustin Perry's statement, and a small evidence bag containing the brown sample from the car door handle. 12 rolls of 35mm film were stored separately in a metal box, never developed. At the top corner of the inventory sheet, a typed line blurred by time, "Case status. Voluntary disappearance, no further action required." Dustin's .357 gun, after being confirmed unrelated to any crime, was returned to its owner just a week later. Chris Knight remembered that handover clearly. Dustin signed the receipt, his handwriting small and neat, without a single tremble. He thanked them in an even tone, then stowed the gun in his trunk and drove off without looking back. That image lingered in Knight's mind for days, but he had no grounds to hold onto the weapon. Everything was legitimate on paper. In the months that followed, the city's life flowed on, as if no woman had ever vanished. In the newspapers, stories of robberies and fires filled the pages, while Megan Walsh's name appeared only once in the missing persons notices. A blurry black and white photo, a brief description. Female, 29 years old, missing in South Boston area, 5 inches tall, brown hair, blue eyes. If you have information, contact Boston PD, and no one ever called. Chris Knight was reassigned to another department in early 1989. The Megan case, along with dozens of other missing persons files, was lumped into the unresolved category. The reports, barely a page thick, were stamped complete, simply because there were no new leads. At the top of the cover, Knight's signature sat next to the red closed, voluntary stamp. He didn't know that that paper had put an end to the final effort to find the girl who had vanished into the rainy night on Harrison Avenue. Years passed, and the basement archives gradually took on the smell of old paper and mildew. Each time a clerk opened the iron door, dust billowed up, the yellowish light from the hanging bulbs casting shadows over the rows of stacked files. Megan Walsh's evidence box sat on the third shelf, between two other forgotten disappearances from the 1970s. The label still clearly read the final date, June 28, 1988. No one paid attention to it anymore. Occasionally, in the early 1990s, Knight still received rare calls from Mrs. Ellen Walsh, asking if there was any news of her daughter. "Nothing new, ma'am," he always replied like a reflex. Each time he hung up, he sat still, listening to the steady ticking of the clock in his office. That case, though closed, remained like a persistent rain in his memory, small, steady, unrelenting, and never quite letting up. Then everything faded. Knight left the police force after nearly 10 years, while file hash 88743 lay dormant under a thick layer of dust in the archives. 10 years, then 20, and no one opened that envelope again. The ink-smudged scrap of paper, the undeveloped rolls of film, the small brown sample stuck to the cloth, all remained intact in the darkness. Outside, Boston changed day by day. Skyscrapers rose in the seaport, the subway rumbled farther out, the city lights grew brighter. But in one quiet corner underground, Megan Walsh's name still lay dormant on the yellowed file cover, waiting for someone to remember that a woman had once disappeared here on a rainy night in 1988. 10 years had passed since file hash 88743 was shelved in the final racks of the Boston PD archives. In 1998, winter arrived earlier than usual. Winds from Massachusetts Bay sweeping through the rows of old brick houses, carrying the scent of salt and metallic dust. In the basement where forgotten cases were stored, dim yellow fluorescent lights cast down over the tall steel shelves, reaching to the ceiling, covered in a thin layer of gray dust. Dave Blanchard, the new archivist officer assigned there, was meticulous to the point of annoyance. He had a habit of inventorying every old file box whenever winter came, as a way to kill time during the long, cold shifts. That afternoon, while scanning the M-Case 80 shelves, Blanchard paused at a brown mottled file box, its label peeling, revealing only a few numbers, 743. He carefully pulled the box down, brushed off the dust, and read the nearly faded line, Megan Walsh, voluntary disappearance, 1988. Inside, the old papers stuck together, reeking of damp mustiness. Amid the paperwork, he spotted a plastic bag labeled film, 35 mm, not developed. Curiosity made him hesitate. The archives were full of hundreds of such rolls, but most were duplicates or ruined shots. What caught his eye was the small note at the bottom corner of the label, garage area, secondary roll. Blanchard took the roll up to the old photo lab, where the developing machine still worked. He carefully loaded the film, the rinse water spreading across the surface with a pungent chemical smell, mingling with the steady whir of the machine. As the first negative emerged, he saw a familiar image, a small garage, flashlight beam slanting across the concrete floor, a shadowy figure at the edge of the frame. On the third and fourth shots, the light flare overexposed parts of the image, but then came the fifth. Blanchard held his breath. Amid the water-pocked floor, a long, dark drag mark appeared, running straight from the interior toward the garage door. The light reflection made it starkly clear, even in uniform, as if something heavy had been dragged away, leaving a faint groove. He tilted the negative left, then right, scrutinizing the drag direction. The streak started near the door leading up to the apartment, then ran straight outward, ending right where the ground shifted to natural light. "Can't be tire marks," he muttered. The width was narrow, long, even, with no interspersed wheel or shoe prints. A seamless drag line, eerily still. Blanchard's skin prickled, not from fear, but from a hunch. 10 years earlier, someone might have seen this image and overlooked it, or perhaps never developed that roll at all. He developed the entire roll, laying the wet negatives out on the light table. Each frame captured the same angle, but with different lighting and perspectives, as if the photographer, likely Chris Knight, had been trying to catch the full drag mark from every angle. The final shot was blurrier, but at the edge of the image, Blanchard noticed that dark streak didn't stop at the floor, but imprinted on the garage door edge. A small silvery scratch. Heavy object with a metal edge, he thought to himself. Blanchard wiped his hands dry, grabbed a small sticky note, and scribbled a few words. Possible drag mark, revisit. He clipped the note along with a freshly printed black and white photo to a separate envelope. Before returning the file box to the shelf, he stood staring at the photo under the yellow light. Something in the image made time feel suspended, not just the trace of an old case, but a reminder that something had been overlooked for far too long. As Blanchard turned off the lights and locked the archive door, the last beam swept across the photo on the table, reflecting off the silvery gray drag line amid the concrete. Outside, the east wind whistled through the door cracks, and from upstairs, the ship horns from Boston Harbor echoed in, distant yet familiar. He climbed the stairs, carrying in his mind the sole remaining image of a rainy night in 1988, where a silent drag mark on the garage floor might be the only sign of a woman who had left this world without anyone knowing how. Nearly 20 years after the day Dave Blanchard developed that old film, the basement archives where he once worked had a new manager. In 2016, the Boston PD established the Cold Case Unit, a small team of seasoned investigators tasked with reviewing hundreds of unsolved cases. The city had changed, the once quiet waterfront now ablaze with new glass buildings. But in that old basement, the dust of time still blanketed the file boxes. Amid thousands of names, Megan Walsh's name was mentioned for the first time in nearly 3 decades. That day, Lieutenant Daniel Haynes, head of the Cold Case Unit, along with his partner, forensic technician Laura Stein, was sifting through files with remaining evidence that could be re-examined. Haynes opened the old electronic catalog, scrolling through a long list of disappearances before stopping at a line with a note, "Evidence intact and sealed, unidentified blood sample, undeveloped film." He murmured softly, "Walsh, 1988. A nurse vanished in South Boston." Laura looked up, replying quietly, "If the sample's pristine, we could try touch DNA." Haynes nodded. "Then let's do it. We start with her." That afternoon they went down to the archives. The fluorescent lights were as dim as ever, casting over the towering steel shelves stacked to the ceiling. Blanchard had retired, but the note he left on the file envelope remained stuck there. Possible drag mark, revisit. When Haynes broke the seal, a fine dust cloud rose, the scent of old paper and chemicals mingling. Inside, Megan's handwritten note, a few blurry black and white photos, and a small evidence bag labeled Substance A, door handle. The dried brown residue still clung intact to the white cloth, carefully folded in a thick nylon bag. Laura picked up the evidence bag, examining it under the light, speaking almost in a whisper. If it's really blood, we could get DNA. The tech now is strong enough to read from just a few cells. Haynes just nodded slightly. They processed the handover to the Massachusetts State Crime Lab, requesting analysis using the latest procedures. Touch DNA analysis, a technique that could isolate and amplify residual genetic material, even in minute amounts. In parallel, the team digitized all 12 rolls of 35 film from the metal box. The rescanned photos revealed details once thought faint. The drag mark on the garage floor, the scratched door edge, and the flashlight-streaked reflections. On the large screen, Laura pointed to the fifth image, where the dark streak stretched to the door. It can't be tire tracks, she said. Width only 11 inches, perfectly even. Someone dragged something. Haynes was silent, staring at the photo, then murmured softly. And it might have been a person. A week later, the lab called. The technician's voice on the other end was excited yet cautious. We have DNA, she said. Small sample but stable. 2 distinct profiles. One matches Megan Walsh and a trace mixture, with male indicators. Haynes froze. Are you sure? Positive. Clean sample, no contamination. That statement reignited a case thought long dead from the previous century. Haynes immediately called a small meeting at the cold case unit headquarters. The garage photo was projected on the wall, next to the DNA results on the board. We have Megan's trace and a man's, he said, his voice low. In the entire file, only one man directly involved, the husband Dustin Perry. A moment of silence enveloped the room. Laura nodded slowly. After nearly 30 years, we have our first piece of evidence. That night, Haynes sat alone in his office, looking out the glass toward the lit-up waterfront. The night wind blew strong, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. On the desk, the garage photo lay beside Megan's handwritten note. He picked up the phone, typing a short memo, reopened case #88743. Megan Walsh, 1988 disappearance. As he hit save, the screen's cold light reflected on his face, mirrored in eyes blending determination and doubt. 30 years after that rainy night, a disappearance thought sunk into oblivion was called back to life. But this time, numbers and technology were no longer luxuries. They were keys. For the first time since 1988, the aged evidence from the sealed basement envelope rose to the surface, and the meaningless dried brown streaks began to speak. The report from the Massachusetts State Crime Lab arrived at the cold case unit in early March 2017. The number displayed in the top right of the first page made Lieutenant Daniel Haynes pause for a few seconds. DNA match probability, 1 in 9.8 billion, nearly impossible to be coincidental. In the attached data file, 2 distinct genetic sequences were compared, segment by segment. One sample matched Megan Walsh's DNA profile perfectly, stored from the hospital where she worked. The other, though just a trace mixture, matched DNA taken from Dustin Perry, the husband long ago ruled out as a suspect, nearly 3 decades prior. Laura Stein placed the printed results on the table, her hand still trembling slightly from pure professional excitement. "This is it, Dan," she said softly. "We just linked the suspect to the scene." Haynes didn't respond right away. He looked out the window, where morning light shone on the glass buildings of South Boston, then turned back to the old garage photo. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years just to hear one voice from a fingernail-sized dried blood streak. The report detailed how they isolated the DNA sample. A thin layer of organic material adhered to the car door handle surface, something the 1988 investigators had only noted as unidentified brown residue. Mass spectrometry confirmed it was human blood, untainted by environmental contaminants. Most cells belonged to Megan, but interspersed were male epithelial cells, matching Dustin Perry. Though the trace amount was so small, it only allowed 2 amplifications. The results were stable, error-free. In the report, the examiner noted clearly, indicates possible direct contact between the two individuals at the time the blood mark was formed. That morning, Haynes convened the investigation team. Megan's old photo sat in the center of the table, beside the new documents. He opened with a curt statement, "We have a murder." No one spoke, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. Laura ran a hand through her hair, saying softly, "If true, he's lived his whole life as if nothing happened." Another officer, older, nodded. "And his wife is lying somewhere, no one knows where." Haynes requested a full profile on Dustin Perry, current address, workplace, financial records, and marital status. Just hours later, the results came back. Perry still lived in Boston, managing night shifts in the anesthesia department at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, remarried in 2004 with 2 stepchildren. For nearly 30 years, he had never left the city. Haynes stared at Perry's recent photo, hair flecked with gray, but the eyes in the ID shot still eerily composed. The next day, he and Laura drove to the Suffolk County District Attorney's office. The building was an old stone structure overlooking downtown, where hallway walls still hung black and white photos of famous cases. Haynes placed the file stack on District Attorney Charles Riddle's desk, a calm, middle-aged man known for his caution. "We want to request a preliminary indictment review," Haynes said. "This is the first forensic evidence proving direct contact between the suspect and victim right before her disappearance." Riddle flipped through the pages, his eyes stopping at the note, "DNA from 1988 sample, source victim's car door handle." He looked up. "Are you sure it's not cross-contamination?" Laura replied firmly. "Impossible." The sample was sealed for nearly 30 years, unopened until the cold case unit took possession. Riddle was silent, removing his glasses, leaning back in his chair. "So we have a touch point, but no body." Haynes nodded. "Not yet, but this is the first time since 1988 we've had proof she didn't leave voluntarily." Riddle looked out the window, where people crossed the plaza in front of the courthouse, then turned back, his voice low and decisive. "I'll authorize the preliminary investigation. Find me everything on him, bank records, vehicles, work schedule, anything proving he lied." As Haynes and Laura left the building, Boston was immersed in a frigid March afternoon. Light snow fell on the parked cars' roofs in front of the plaza, melting on contact with the ground. Laura was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you think he still remembers that night?" Haynes looked straight toward the seaport, where harbor lights reflected on the gray water. "If he has a memory," he replied softly, "he's long forgotten how to be afraid." The Megan Walsh case, shelved for nearly 30 years, was now officially reopened. The first piece of evidence, just a small blood stain on a door handle, had unlocked the door to the darkest part of the past, where a man still lived calmly in the city, carrying a secret that 1988's technology had never been advanced enough to uncover. 3 weeks after the DNA results were forwarded to the Suffolk County District Attorney's office, Boston was hit by an unexpected cold snap, even in April. Brief downpours swept through and stopped, leaving a thin mist clinging to the water in the Seaport District, an area once an old cargo dock, now being dredged and filled for waterfront commercial expansion. Amid the rumble of excavators and the thud of steel pilings driven into the harbor bed, no one noticed a worker shouting, pointing down at the crane net just hauled up from the deep mud. Among rotted wood scraps and rusted iron, tangled in black seaweed, lay a gray steel handgun, short barrel, rusted nearly entirely. The construction crew immediately halted work and called the harbor police. Just 2 hours later, word reached the cold case unit. When Lieutenant Daniel Haynes and technician Laura Stein arrived, the area was cordoned off. Haynes stood at the edge of the wooden pier, looking down at the dark water. Below, small ripples reflected the crane's floodlights, mottled like a warped mirror. The harbor officer brought over a large evidence bag containing the just retrieved gun, the metal flaking with rust, but its shape still clear. Under the white light, the faint engraving on the body was still readable. Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. Laura opened her notebook, rereading the old file. Dustin Perry's gun, she said. Registered in 1987, serial number B32741. Haynes signaled the technician to shine a flashlight on the grip. After lightly wiping the mud, the numbers emerged, corroded but each character still clearly legible. B32741. No further verification needed. He exhaled softly, then murmured, 30 years underwater, and we still found it. The gun was taken to the forensics lab. The cleaning process took 2 full days. Beneath the thick rust layer, the internal metal remained intact, thanks to a special heavy grease. When the technician examined the barrel, they noticed something odd. Inside the bore lingered a smooth, glossy lubricant layer, unlike ordinary machine oil. Laura leaned in to sniff lightly, then confirmed immediately. This is medical lubricant, used to preserve surgical equipment or operating room tools. The statement silenced the room for a few seconds. Haynes looked at her, their eyes meeting, no words needed. Small debris fragments from the chamber were collected, including lead residue and black powder fibers. Later analysis showed the gun had been fired, at least 1 round, then wiped clean with alcohol solution before being dumped in the water. Not discarded because it was broken, but to dispose of it, Haynes said, and he did it right after the incident. The chilling coincidence was the gun's location, little more than a mile from where Megan lived. Directly along the harbor route, a neighbor had once said they saw Dustin's car heading that night of the disappearance. That evening, back at headquarters, Haynes unrolled the 1988 Boston map across the table. He used a red pen to connect the points: Megan's apartment, Dustin's house, and the harbor spot where the gun was found. The lines formed an almost perfect triangle, distances between points all under 2 miles. Laura stood beside him, following the lightly trembling pen strokes. "Do you think he dumped the gun that night?" she asked. Haynes nodded. "Right after covering his tracks, medical lube, barrel wipe, then drive to the harbor. He worked nights. No one notices a guy in scrubs driving through here late." He leaned down, rotating the map, looking again at the pier location where the gun had lain for nearly 30 years. The still waters of the seaport reflected the city lights outside the window, as if guarding a secret no one wanted unearthed. "He's lived less than 2 miles from here his whole life," Haynes said softly, "and what he tried to bury was his own evidence." When the examination was complete, the report sent to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office featured 3 standout lines: gun type Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, serial number. Matches Dustin Perry's legally registered gun from 1987. Traces: medical lubricant and firing residue in the barrel. Conclusion: weapon cleaned and dumped in water within 24-48 hours after the disappearance. Holding the results in his hand, Haynes sat silently for a long time. The story was no longer about a missing woman, but a crime buried at the bottom of the water, right in the city's heart. Outside, nighttime Boston gleamed brighter than in days past. But in that cold office, the light still fell on the black and white photo of Megan Walsh, her eyes seeming to gaze toward the harbor, where at last the truth of 30 years ago was found. The next morning, as a thin mist still covered the seaport harbor waters, Lieutenant Daniel Haynes returned to the cold case unit headquarters with a steaming black coffee and a thick stack of freshly printed files. The gun had brought a crucial breakthrough, but he knew that without proving the exact timeline of the crime, everything remained hypothesis. "We need to reconstruct that entire night," he said to Laura Stein, his voice low and hoarse after a sleepless night. "Every minute, every gap." They began with Megan's work schedule for the evening of June 28, 1988. The backup copy from Boston City Hospital showed she finished her shift at 10:15 p.m., leaving the main gate about 10 minutes later, matching the security guard's witness statement exactly. At the convenience store on Washington Street, the receipt stamped at 10:31 p.m. clearly listed 2 items: a bottle of milk and a pack of cookies. After that, about 10 minutes was the walking distance home. Logically, she should have arrived at the apartment on Dorchester Avenue around 10:45 p.m., but from that moment, all traces of her vanished. Laura opened the old telephone records file, extracted from Postal Service archives, the rare kind still surviving from the 1980s. In the list of outgoing calls from Dustin Perry's home, there was one at 10:41 p.m. to Ellen Walsh's number, Megan's mother. The call lasted 18 seconds, and no one remembered what was said. Ellen had only told the 1988 investigators that the phone rang, but when she picked up, the other end was silent, just wind and static. Now cross-referenced, it became the first piece in the timeline. The call made from Dustin's house, just minutes before Megan was due home. Haynes placed 3 documents side by side on the table: the hospital timesheet, the store receipt, and the call log. He connected them with red pen, then wrote below: 10:15, 10:45, Megan on her way home. 10:41, call made from Dustin's house. Under the office light, the red writing stood out starkly on the white paper, cold as a verdict unspoken. But that wasn't the final piece. Laura brought over Dustin's work records for that night, pulled from the hospital where he was on shift. The timesheet clearly stated, off shift, approved absence. The line was written in blue ink, the handwriting not matching the manager's signature. Who wrote this? Haynes asked. Laura replied, unclear. The original file only has a photocopy. He leaned in to look again, then murmured, if it wasn't his boss who wrote it, he might have altered it himself. The two continued tracing the 1988 neighbor's statement, the woman who said that around midnight, she saw Dustin's green Civic leaving the garage. Cross-checked with weather data, that night had light rain, southeast winds, poor visibility. The drive from his house to the harbor took just over 10 minutes. And at the location where the gun was found, the estimated time of dumping into the water was around 11 o'clock p.m., based on current direction and sediment settling. It all fit together chillingly. Megan left the hospital at 10:15, stopped at the store at 10:31, arrived home around 10:45. At the same time, a call from Dustin's house to her mother, 18 seconds of silence. After that, no one heard anything more. The gap from 10:30 to 11:15 was the only window when everything happened. The encounter, the argument, then disappearance. Haynes leaned back in his chair, looking at Megan's photo placed next to the Boston map. She never left, he said softly. He called her mother right before he did it. Laura nodded faintly, her voice almost a whisper, and then drove to the harbor, dumped everything in the water, the gun, the story. As the afternoon light slanted through the glass window, casting on the wall full of notes, the case timeline finally complete. No longer vague hypotheses, but a chain of actions tightly linked by data, evidence, and logic. Only one man present, one opportunity, one motive. Dustin Perry. Haynes stood up, gathered the files, and said to Laura before leaving the office, I don't need more witnesses. Time is witness enough. Outside, the wind blew through the seaport, carrying the soft lapping of waves under the pier, where nearly 30 years ago, the truth had been thrown down with the rusted gun, and now was surfacing, piece by piece. The cold case unit headquarters was lit up all night that day. On the walls, the old 1988 photos were enlarged, hung along a whiteboard covered in new red marker notes. Lieutenant Daniel Haynes and forensic technician Laura Stein stood before a large screen, where a 3D image of Megan Walsh's apartment garage was reconstructed using spatial scanning technology. Each frame was a piece of that rainy night: concrete floor, wooden door leading outside, long dark drag mark, flashlight light reflecting like the breath of the past. Start the simulation, Haynes ordered. Laura pressed the button. The virtual model moved slowly, recreating the exact positions of every object in the garage. The Chevrolet Nova parked askew, small storage cabinet to the left, 4.3-meter drag mark running from the apartment door down to the garage mouth. Haynes crossed his arms, eyes following. Drag direction outward, he said. Just like the film Blanchard developed in 1998, Laura nodded. We measured the groove depth and analyzed light angles, weight of the dragged object about 120 to 140 pounds, exactly Megan's body weight. On the screen, small bright points displayed each physical sample. The latest forensics data showed the gray-silver microfibers found in the garage dust matched the fibers from the carpet in Dustin Perry's trunk exactly. "Where are they?" Haynes asked. "Right in the middle of the drag mark," Laura replied, zooming in. 3 parallel fibers, stuck tight in the concrete cracks. Spectroscopy showed the same polyester-nylon blend, same wear, same dye ratio. No coincidence. "So what did he drag her with?" Haynes asked gravely. Laura pointed to the model, likely the car mat. "He wrapped the victim in it, dragged her through the garage, then loaded her into the trunk." On the screen, Laura played the motion simulation, a virtual figure lying on its side, dragged along the floor, head toward the door. As the light swept across, faint streaks on the floor appeared clear. "It all matches the real photo drag marks," she said. Haynes stood frozen, watching the motion. The scene silent to the point of eeriness. "She was attacked in the house," he said quietly. "Possibly in the living room, where we saw the displaced chair and broken water glass, then dragged down to the garage. No large bloodstains, meaning he cleaned up before leaving." Laura opened another data set, forensic physics analysis. She pointed to the drag direction diagram and friction levels on the concrete. If just dragging a heavy object, friction would create shallow, broken streaks. But here, the streak is continuous, deeper toward the door. That indicates the dragged object had evenly distributed mass, like a fully wrapped human body. And the drag direction straight outward, no stopping points. "And the timing?" Haynes asked. Laura displayed the light and temperature simulation chart. "We based it on the film photos, flashlight type, and water reflection on the floor. Capture time around 11 p.m., meaning the streak was still wet when night arrived at the scene the next morning. So the incident happened less than 6 hours before police arrived." Haynes looked at the timeline map hung nearby. 10:15. Megan leaves hospital. 10:31. Store receipt. 10:41. Call from Dustin's house. 10:45. Megan arrives home. 11 o'clock. Dustin's car leaves garage. Every timestamp matched perfectly. He sighed softly, clenching his hand into a fist. "No gaps left," he said. "No one else." Laura opened another comparison frame, a section of gray-silver car mat seized from the old Boston PD storage. Under the microscope, the fabric fibers were creased, stuck with sea salt mud, matching the soil type in the seaport area. "He used this very mat," she said, "then dumped the body somewhere near the harbor before tossing the gun." Haynes nodded faintly, eyes not leaving the screen. "I don't think he buried it deep, maybe just pushed into the mud under the pier." He was silent for a moment, then turned to Laura. "Reconstruct the full sequence of actions. We need to prove the movement chain." Laura started the final simulation. The room darkened. Only the blue glow from the screen remaining. A figure representing Megan appeared, from the living room to the garage door, along the drag mark, then vanishing off-screen. The path marked in red, ending at the current pier location, where the gun was dredged up. Below the timeline, a digital clock displayed 10:45, 11:10. Both stood still, the hum of the computer fan, and the clatter of pens on the table blended into the thick air. Haynes said softly, "For 30 years, no one saw her go anywhere because she never left the house, at least, not on her own 2 feet." Laura turned off the model, the room light flicking back on. "And this," she said, placing a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was a white wool fiber fragment, found on the edge of Megan's raincoat stored in the file. "We tested it, and found it's from Perry's coat medical wool sweater, only issued by the hospital where he worked." Haynes looked at the tiny fiber like a hair, his voice hoarse. "He held her, then killed her." He stepped to the window, looking down at the darkened harbor. Ship horns echoed distantly, the wind carrying cold, salty chill. "He did it right here," he said slowly, "in a city that never forgets, but also never looks back." When he turned back in, he gathered all the documents, stacking them neatly into an envelope. On the label he wrote, "Reconstructed scene, verified physical link between victim and suspect." the thin paper, but heavy as 30 years of time. That night, Haynes didn't go home. He sat in the empty room, looking at the black and white photos spread across the table. It all fit. DNA, the gun, carpet fibers, timeline, scene simulation. The final piece complete. Outside, Boston Harbor winds howled, and in the waves crashing against the pier, he heard as if a voice whispering, soft but clear, "I never left." 2 weeks after completing the scene reconstruction model, Lieutenant Daniel Haynes received a call from the Boston PD Digital Archives Department. The person on the line said an old item had just been restored in the digitization batch of 1980s audio tapes, a cassette from Megan Walsh's apartment answering machine. It was seized the day police searched the house in 1988, but never listened to again because the tape was damaged and the old machine incompatible. "It's playable now," the technician said. "You should come see it." Haynes drove to the Audio Forensics Center, a building tucked behind the South City's industrial area. In the small room lit by yellow lamps, a young engineer operated the signal recovery unit. The old cassette, plastic case yellowed to smoke, turned slowly in the machine. Static hum first, then an outdated robotic female voice. "You have one new message." Haynes and Laura Stein, who came along, leaned toward the speaker. A short pause, then the sound emerged. Scratchy, noisy, but clear. Wind, water, and a long ship horn wail. After that, faint buoy bells could be heard. Steady. Cling. 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 Laura looked up, heart pounding. "You hear that? Buoy bells. Anchor-type bells in deep water." Haynes nodded faintly, eyes fixed on the tape. After a few seconds, the sound shifted to a car engine, starting and fading away, then silence. No words, no voices, just ragged breathing at the start. Short, heavy, then lost amid the waves. The audio engineer stopped the machine, looking at them. "I measured the environmental frequencies, not city wind. This is harborside sound, location, possibly seaport or South Boston docks." Laura opened her laptop, pulling up the 1988 city sound map she'd requested from Maritime Archives. On the map, each harbor area had a signature sound profile, intervals between ship horns, buoy bell frequencies, wind direction. "Listen to the bell section again," she said, rewinding to the cling, cling, cling. Haynes looked up. Interval between each is 4.8 seconds. Only one buoy in the seaport matches that rhythm, buoy E12, near the old pier where we found the gun. The room fell silent. Haynes said slowly, "So that call, the last one on the machine, was recorded at the exact time Megan vanished, and it came from right the area where he dumped the gun." Laura nodded. The answering machine might have auto-activated on phone line static, or someone called accidentally from the dock. Either way, this audio gives us something no other evidence has, the actual disposal location. They sent the tape to MIT's Audio Analysis Lab for precise geolocation. Experts used acoustic wave reconstruction to compare against original environmental data, calculating wind direction, humidity and water resonance frequencies. Results came back in just 2 days. Sound source matches 97% with Pier 6 area, Seaport District. Probability of recording within 200-meter radius of gun recovery site. Haynes looked at the conclusion line, a chill running down his spine. "She was there," he said softly. "It all leads to the same point, the timeline, the gun, the drag mark, and now the sound." Laura sat silent, eyes fixed on the map. If this tape recorded that night, he might have been standing there dumping the gun. Megan could still have been in the car. Haynes requested replaying the recording once more. As the wind and bells sounded, he closed his eyes. The ship horn slithered through the space, echoing off the room walls, like from 30 years ago. He imagined the rainy harbor night, a green Civic pulling up, the man opening the trunk, a heavy object dragged across the wooden pier, then splashing into the water. Then, metal hitting waves, the gun, and the empty apartment's answering machine auto-triggering, capturing that guilty moment over the open phone line. 30 years, Haynes said. voice low and hoarse. We just heard the moment he buried everything again. He signaled the engineer to back up the tape, sealing the original. The attached log noted just one short line: recovered cassette recording. Environmental match to Seaport Dock E12. On the drive away from the center, night wind from the sea blew strong, salt and rust scent filling the air. Laura looked out, where the red light of buoy E12 still flashed rhythmically amid the waves. "Do you think her body's still there?" she asked. Haynes replied, "Not turning. Don't know. But that's where he ended the story. And where we'll start again." Under the dim moonlight, Boston Seaport lay still like an aged witness. The offshore buoy bell still rang steady, 4.8-second rhythm, like a reminder that some secrets can't sink forever in the water. August 2017, Boston welcomed an unusual sunny spell. Skies clear but wind still autumn chill. At the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, District Attorney Charles Riddle signed the emergency arrest warrant at 9 a.m. Blue ink slanted lightly, decisive, warrant for arrest. Dustin Perry. Below was Lieutenant Daniel Haynes's signature, the man who had just closed over a year of sifting through every fragment of the 30-year-old disappearance. As the pen left the paper, the room fell silent. Riddle said curtly, "Bring him in. Don't let anyone know ahead." By noon, the Boston PD task force, coordinated with the cold case unit, quietly fanned out around Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, where Dustin managed night shifts in anesthesia. Haynes chose 2 p.m. peak hospital bustle. Everyone preoccupied, least notice. He wanted the arrest quick, clean, no time for the suspect to react. Outside, sunlight glinted off the hospital glass, flooding the entire seaport in a cold, blinding light. At the same time, the search team deployed to Perry's suburban home in Quincy. In the second-floor study, they found a wooden cabinet loosely locked. Inside were old calendar notebooks, one for each year Perry worked. The 1988 one lay at the drawer bottom, pages yellowed. Flipping to the last week of June, the original note "off shift, personal leave" appeared, but the handwriting differed from the rest. Bold strokes, slightly slanted, like written hastily later. Under the light, the blue ink bled faintly, showing a different pen type entirely. In the page corner, a faint erasure of night shift scratched out. A small detail, but enough to confirm the work schedule altered, and that night Perry had no shift, as he once claimed. At the hospital, Haynes and Laura entered the quiet anesthesia wing hallway, where only ventilator hums and steady footsteps on polished floors sounded. Perry stood by the duty desk, white coat on, conferring with a nurse. When he saw the two approaching, his eyes froze for half a second. Haynes presented the warrant, voice low and clear. "Dustin Perry, you're under arrest for suspicion in the death of Megan Walsh." The room went still, only the clock second-hand sweeping. Perry didn't react violently, just removed his gloves, set them on the desk, then looked up at Haynes. 30 years, he said slowly. "I knew one day you'd come back." 2 officers stepped forward to cuff him, the cuffs clicking sharply, echoing down the stark white hallway. Hospital colleagues paused, eyes stunned. No one spoke. Perry bowed his head, face eerily composed, only his unblinking eyes empty. Haynes looked at him, said nothing more, then with Laura escorted him out through the side door. Afternoon sun slanted down, reflecting off the waiting police car windows. As the car door shut, news began spreading. A young doctor in the department called the local paper, and just hours later, the first headline appeared on the Boston Globe front page. Cold case 1988, reopened. Local anesthetist arrested in connection with disappearance of nurse Megan Walsh. That evening, Boston TV stations aired it non-stop. Reporters stood before the hospital, behind them dozens of still-shocked medical staff. An older nurse who worked with Megan choked up, "We still remember her." No one believed it was him. The usually bustling hospital grounds fell quiet. Cold neon lights reflected off the glass, where shadows of doctors and nurses overlapped, like souls peering out from the past. At Perry's house, the search team continued finding more documents. They discovered a small metal box hidden in the basement, inside old photos. Megan smiling in her nurse uniform, along with loose notes, mostly anesthesia drug formulas. On one scrap, handwriting in black ink. Too much noise. Needs silence. Haynes got the report while sitting in his car outside the hospital, watching people come and go. He said nothing, just stared straight down the road, where patrol car blue lights still flashed in the dusk. Laura sat beside him, saying softly, "We got him." Haynes replied, voice low and firm, "No. We just reopened this city's wound." That night, arrest news spread across Boston. On medical forums, people debated, stunned, then fell silent. One doctor wrote, "We worked with him for decades, never saw anything off." But in the white hallways, everyone felt a chill run down their spine. 30 years passed, and Megan Walsh's ghost finally stepped back into the city's heart. Not through words, but through cold, shining cuffs, locked around the wrists of the man who was once her colleague. Boston Police Department Interrogation Room 3 that evening, lit only by a dim yellow bulb. Air thick, stale, cold coffee smell, mixing with lingering detective cigarette smoke on the walls. Dustin Perry sat at the table center, hands loosely cuffed, hospital blouse collar still sweat-stained. Across from him, Lieutenant Daniel Haynes opened the thick file, pages rustling like old metal scraping. Beside him, Laura Stein sat silent, small recorder between them, red light blinking. Haynes spoke first, voice even, neither high nor low. "Dustin, I'll show you a few things. We want you to explain, not for me, but for her." He pulled out two large format photos, 35 mm film shots, enlarged to show every detail. The garage floor drag mark running straight to the door, car mat with silver fibers. Haynes set the photos before Perry, then added a printed DNA test result sheet. "This is Megan's blood, and this is your epithelial sample." The two stuck together on her car door handle. "Anything you want to say?" Perry stared down at the table, his two fingers interlaced, knuckles white as bone. A long silence stretched out. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock counted the seconds. Haynes tapped lightly on the photo. 30 years you've lived here, passing the harbor every day. You thought you'd gotten away with it, didn't you?" Perry still said nothing. His eyes moved slowly, as if reading every glint of light on the table surface. Laura turned on the projector, the 3D crime scene image appearing on the wall, reconstructing the garage space. "This is Megan's home," she said, her voice light but cold. "You dragged her from inside to outside, wrapped in the car mat, then loaded her into the trunk. She was still breathing then." Perry looked up, his eyes flickering with panic, then lowered them again. "I don't remember clearly," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Everything happened so fast." Haynes slid another photo forward. The rusted .357 gun, just dredged from the seaport harbor. "This is yours. Serial number matches. The medical lubricant in the barrel matches the type you use in anesthesia. You dumped it that night, didn't you?" Perry was silent, lips pressed tight. Haynes leaned back, arms crossed. "You know, what surprises me isn't the crime, but the patience. 30 years. You passed right by the place where you buried her, and your hand never shook." Minutes passed, only heavy breathing. Then Perry spoke, so softly Laura had to lean in to hear. "She fell," he said. "She fell, hit her head on the table edge. I didn't mean to." Haynes looked straight at him. "You mean to say it was all an accident?" Perry nodded, eyes down. "I panicked. I saw blood, thought she was dead. I didn't know what to do. I cleaned up, then took her away." Haynes didn't react, just said slowly, "Took her where?" Perry was silent, his throat twitching slightly. Laura placed the garage photo gently before him. "Dustin, there's no hiding anymore. DNA, fibers, the gun, the seaport recording, all point to the same thing. But only you can say where she's lying." He looked up, his gaze blurring with tears. "I didn't mean to kill her. We argued. She said she wanted to leave, take the boys to her mother's. I lost control. She backed away, slipped, then blood." He paused, voice choking. I just thought if anyone found out, I'd lose everything. I took her. I drove to the harbor. Haynes leaned forward, asking almost in a whisper, "Where is she, Dustin?" A long pause. Perry looked down at his cuffed hands, then said on an exhale, "Old concrete vault, near Pier 6, Seaport. The former cold storage unit. I pried the lid, placed her in there, closed it, then I left." No one said anything more. Laura just stared at the man before her hand unconsciously gripping the pen tight. Haynes stood, quietly turning off the projector. The room went fully dark, only the faint yellow light casting on Perry's pale face. "Do you know they're clearing that area now?" he asked. "If we don't get there in time, they'll pour concrete over the entire vault next month." Perry closed his eyes, tears rolling down his cheek. "I know," he said softly. "I pass by it every day." Haynes looked at him for a long time, then signaled to Laura. She turned off the recorder, gathered the documents. As the two officers led Perry from the room, he turned back, voice faint. "I just wanted to bury the past. But it seems it won't stay down." As the interrogation room door closed, Haynes sat down, looking at the empty chair. On the table, the garage photo still lay there, next to the scrawled handwritten note from the old file. "Tell the boys I'll be back soon." He closed his eyes, breathed deep. Outside, wind from the seaport harbor blew in, carrying the low, mournful ship horn echoing through the iron-framed windows. An hour later, the forensics team was dispatched to the scene based on Perry's statement. Haynes stood by the window, watching the police car lights stretch toward the harbor, like a thin ribbon of light advancing into the darkness. After 30 years, the story had finally led them to where it once began, underground cold, amid the salty damp and crumbling concrete of the old seaport. Boston's sky poured rain as the forensics convoy entered the old seaport area. The abandoned waterfront, once the city's transport hub, before being left vacant in the early 1990s. Winds from Massachusetts Bay whipped through, carrying the scent of salt and rusting metal. Blue and red lights from dozens of patrol cars flashed on the mottled concrete walls, reflecting down onto the ink-black water. Lieutenant Daniel Haynes stood amid the fine rain, coat soaked, looking at the area map in his hand. His fingers stopped at the marker for Storage Unit B12, the old cold storage vault Dustin Perry had mentioned in the interrogation. "Right here," he said to the forensics team lead. "Dig down 3 meters, behind the cracked brick wall row." The drill's roar shattered the damp cold air. Sand and shattered concrete sprayed, the choking smell of rust and sea mud rising. With every inch dug deeper, the concrete grew harder, as if this place had been patched over to hide something. After nearly 2 hours, one of the technicians shouted, "Something here." Everyone leaned in. Beneath the damp soil, a dark green fabric scrap emerged, aged to near fusion with the mud. Haynes stepped closer, bending low, recognizing the color all too eerily. "Raincoat," he whispered. Her raincoat, the green raincoat Megan had worn, leaving the hospital that night, now just tattered fabric. But the metal buttons still intact, engraved with initials BCH. Boston City Hospital. Beneath the fabric, a small, bright object glinted under the flashlight. The technician extracted it with tweezers, a silver nurse's badge, angel wings outstretched, back engraved M. Walsh. No one spoke. Only the patter of rain on the metal bin lids and the heavy breathing of those witnessing. As the next layer of soil was peeled away, what lay below stunned the entire forensics team, a partially decomposed human skeletal structure, skull still intact, lying on its side, facing the wall. The light shone on it, reflecting a glint of white tooth amid the mud. Beside it was a small metal frame, possibly the remnants of the personal medical bag Megan carried on every shift. Everything nearly frozen in the mud, naturally preserved for 3 decades. Laura Stein, in white protective gear, knelt by the pit, gloves caked in mud. She gently brushed soil from around the cervical and shoulder bones, then looked up at Haynes. "No doubt anymore," she said softly. "It's her." Haynes was silent, throat tight. He removed his hat, standing looking down, letting the rain pelt his face. In that moment, he felt as if the whole city held its breath. Boston, after 30 years, finally returning Megan Walsh to her place in this world. The entire area was cordoned off. Every fragment was carefully sampled, sealed separately. The green raincoat, silver badge, bone fragments, and soil samples from around the pit were all sent to the Massachusetts State Crime Lab that same night. As the evidence transport vehicle left the pier, the rain had eased, leaving only the quiet lapping of waves against the pier wall. 3 days later, the identification results arrived at the cold case unit office. DNA extracted from the bone marrow matched perfectly with victim mother Ellen Walsh's sample, stored in the database since the 2000s. No doubt remained, the body found in the concrete vault was Megan Walsh, the young nurse who vanished on a rainy June night in 1988. Beside the bone remnants was a small fracture on the right temporal, consistent with Perry's statement that she fell and hit her head on the table. But the radiating cracks and skull trauma indicated far greater force, equivalent to a blow from a hard object, not a natural fall. The lab report concluded, cause of death, traumatic brain injury from external impact. Degree of fracture and injury angle inconsistent with typical fall. The words brief, but enough to close 30 years of doubt. As Haynes read to the final line, he folded the file, breathing deep. In the small room, Laura sat across, looking out the window where sunset light dyed the sky red. "So it's over," she said, voice light as breath. "We found her." Haynes didn't reply right away. He stood, looking at Megan's photo pinned to the wallboard. She still smiled gently in her nurse uniform, eyes lit with serene light. "No," he said at last. "Not over, just the rest of the truth has come back." That afternoon, the vehicle carrying the remains left the morgue, crossing the old bridge toward Seaport. Ellen and Patrick Walsh stood waiting by the roadside, hands clasped, faces lined but peaceful. As the small white-draped casket was loaded onto the hearse, wind from the bay blew in, carrying salt scent and low mournful ship horns. No one cried, only a quiet sense, as if the whole city had just bowed its head. That evening, Haynes sat alone in his office, looking at the black and white photos spread across the table. From the garage drag mark, the rusted gun underwater, to the green raincoat just unearthed, every final piece had connected. The case was no longer a disappearance, but a crime with a name, a perpetrator. A voice returned. He opened the window, harbor wind rushing in, carrying damp and salt. In the distant waves, Haynes heard as if a voice whispering, soft but clear, "I'm home." 30 years, a city changed, people aged, but justice finally found its way back. File hash 88743, closed not with a red ink stamp, but with the profound silence of the night sea, where Megan Walsh's secret once lay buried. Now only wind and faint yellow lights reflecting on the water, reminding Boston that sometimes truth just needs time to surface. 3 months after Megan Walsh's body was confirmed, Boston entered autumn. Blue skies, flaming red maple leaves, blanketing the paths around Suffolk County Courthouse. But in that fresh air, something still chilled when Dustin Perry's name was first called aloud in courtroom 2. Outside in the hallway, dozens of reporters packed the wooden benches, camera lights flashing non-stop. This was Boston's longest cold case closure since the 1980s, and the whole city watched. Dustin entered, hands cuffed, gray shirt, rumpled. His silver hair and empty gaze made him look older than his years. In the front row, Lieutenant Daniel Haynes sat still, eyes never leaving the defendant. Beside him was Laura Stein, gripping tight the file they'd carried from the first day of reopening. At the prosecution table, Suffolk County District Attorney Charles Riddle stood, his voice ringing even, cold and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear the story of a woman robbed of her chance to live, and a man who buried the truth for nearly 30 years. But no hypotheses, no doubts. DNA, physical traces, audio, and evidence from the confession all point to one man, Dustin Perry. Riddle presented each piece, matching DNA results, garage fibers matching Perry's car mat, the .357 gun with medical lubricant, the cassette tape recording Seaport buoy bells, and finally images of the green raincoat and hospital badge found in the concrete vault. Each exhibit projected on the large screen, silencing the courtroom to only the rustle of reporters' papers. When Megan's body photo appeared, many bowed heads, a few women teary-eyed. The defense attorney tried to pivot the case, arguing Dustin Perry acted in panic after an accident, that no direct evidence proves intent to kill. But Riddle countered calmly, pointing to the scene photo. This wasn't an accident. This is the mark of deliberate action, cleaning the scene, disposing, dumping the gun in the sea, altering the shift log. This was a plan. For hours, Dustin sat motionless, not a word. When the judge called a recess, he still didn't glance toward the Walsh family seated at the back. Ellen, hair fully white, clutched her daughter's photo tight. Patrick silent, eyes sunken as if holding 30 years of waiting. On the third day of trial, the courtroom air thick to suffocation. Riddle opened the morning with a short sentence, "Justice has no expiration date." He reread Dustin's interrogation statement. "She fell. I panicked. I hid everything." Then he paused, seconds, looking straight at the defendant and saying slowly, "You didn't hide everything, you hid a person. And she lay in your shadow for 30 years. Afternoon shifted to closing arguments. The defense requested the jury allow his client to plead to a lesser charge, manslaughter by negligent act without intent to kill. Riddle rose to object, but the judge permitted negotiation. He turned to Haynes, eyes annoyed. Sometimes the law must choose between truth and probability. Haynes just nodded. He understood, though justice arrived, it always came late and incomplete. Late afternoon, Dustin Perry stood, his voice hoarse, soft, but clear in the pin-drop silent room. "I plead guilty. I didn't mean to, but I hid it. I was afraid, and I know I was wrong." Haynes looked at him long. In that moment, he saw not a perpetrator, but a shadow man who lived 30 years in his own fear of discovery, of looking back. But that erased nothing of what he'd done. On November 22, 2017, Suffolk County Court officially sentenced Dustin Perry guilty of involuntary manslaughter, 15 years imprisonment. The judge ended with a short statement, "30 years of running doesn't shorten time. Justice may be slow, but it still arrives." As officers led the defendant from the room, press jammed the hallway. Flashbulbs popped relentlessly, casting cold light on Perry's impassive face. In the reporter's den, Ellen Walsh said softly, almost just for Haynes to hear, "Finally, she can rest," he replied. "Yes, ma'am, she's home." The next day, the Cold Case Unit office updated the case status in the system, case hash 88743. Megan Walsh. Status solved, 1988-2017. The short line holding 3 decades of pain, persistence, and quiet refusal to forget. That night, Haynes drove through Seaport, where lights reflected on the flat water. He stopped by the old pier, looking afar, where the concrete vault once hid Megan, now built into a memorial park. Wind carried the steady buoy bell echoing back, 4.8 seconds each, like the city's heartbeat. And in the hazy light, he saw himself smile faintly, not for victory, but because finally, Boston had stopped being silent. When the verdict was read, Boston shook as if the whole city drew a cold breath. News spread in hours, from evening broadcasts to next morning's papers, headlines bold, model husband, exemplary nurse, perpetrator hidden for 29 years. In hospitals, colleagues who'd worked with Dustin Perry were speechless. One doctor stunned before reporters. "We had lunch with him every day, never suspected a thing. The idea that someone like that could kill his wife, it's unbelievable." On old streets around Dorchester Avenue, neighbors gathered on porches gossiping. Those who'd lived near Megan Walsh's apartment recalled that every rainy season, They still heard wind whistling through the alley, and now understood why that feeling chilled them. An elderly woman quietly placed a small flower bouquet before apartment 12's door. Once Megan's home, telling reporters, she was so sweet, she just wanted peace. Turns out, her silence was a cry for help no one heard. 3 days later, the Walsh family held a memorial by Seaport Pier, right where Megan's body was found. Light drizzle fell, wind carrying sea salt scent. Attendees stood in a circle, holding candles, golden light casting on the deep black water. Ellen Walsh, in an old shawl, spoke in a trembling voice, "Thank you to this city, to those who didn't give up." Megan waited so long to hear someone say she didn't disappear. She was taken. In the back row, Lieutenant Haynes and Laura Stein stood silent, wordless. Haynes looked to the water, where pier lights reflected, shimmering like thousands of washed memories. The ceremony closed with a moment of silence. As buoy E12's bells rang steady, everyone released white flowers onto the water, each petal carrying the name of another missing woman in Boston, yet unfound. Wind blew strong, but the blooms drifted in a long line toward the sea, like a flow of memory refusing to be forgotten. The Megan Walsh case made Boston's police system look inward. In the following month, Boston PD announced the Old Missing Persons File Re-Review Protocol, a large-scale program to sift hundreds of lingering disappearances from the 1970s and 80s. Forgotten paper files in basements would be digitized, old evidence retested with new DNA tech. The police chief's statement rang in the press conference, "No disappearance is old if family still waits." The Megan Walsh case reminds us justice never truly sleeps. Police academies in the state added this case to curricula as a textbook lesson on long-term evidence preservation importance. The Boston Globe commented, "A small blood stain on a door handle, seemingly meaningless, awakened an investigative system dormant for 30 years. On the last evening of that year, Boston rained again. In Seaport, the newly renovated waterfront gleamed with lights. People still stopped at the small memorial by the pier, where silver lettering read, "In memory of Megan Walsh 1960-1988. Truth never drowns." Haynes paused before the plaque, pulling from his pocket an old scrap, the copy of the note that once made everyone believe Megan left voluntarily. "Tell the boys I'll be back soon." He folded it, placed it on the stone, then turned away, saying nothing. Afar, buoy E12 tolled long again, echoes carrying into the city. Those by the pier stood listening, sea wind blowing salt and night mist. 30 years, Boston changed. But that night, in the bells rising from the water, everyone felt a small voice whispering from the depths, not resentful, not angry, just a gentle, complete confirmation. 29 years passed. Boston finally heard the truth from the water's bottom. The Megan Walsh story in Boston reminds us of three very everyday things that decide life and death in America today: vigilance against domestic violence, preserving evidence, and not letting missing persons files fall into voluntary departure, limbo. The first slip wasn't at Seaport but in labeling it voluntary disappearance just because of the note. "Tell the boys I'll be back soon," an ambiguous scribble easily forged. Lesson: when a loved one goes suddenly silent, don't rush to accept the needs space hypothesis. Demand welfare checks, lockdown, call histories, shopping receipts, nearby cameras, like the 1031 receipt and 1041 call, that became key. Second, technology can save a case if evidence is kept right. Brown streak on door handle, answering machine cassette tape, 35mm photos, even buoy E12 bells. Outdated things forming the strongest testimony when touch DNA, photo digitization, audio analysis enter. So don't clean the scene when a loved one vanishes. Photograph, seal items, log timelines. Third, community is part of justice. Neighbor seeing civic leave garage late, dredger worker hauling point, 357 Magnum, and Seaport Memorial turning personal memory into shared duty. For police departments, when Boston PD updated cold case protocols, It's a reminder of organizational humility, always ready to reopen files with new tech. Justice comes late, but only if we don't let go. If you believe truth, even buried 29 years underwater, still deserves to be heard. Hit subscribe to join us in continuing the journey to reclaim justice for cases thought forgotten. Thank you for following the Megan Walsh story. See you in the next video, where another American secret prepares to rise from the shadows.